Man, I really gotta do another one of these. Can't I just, put it off for another 10 months? Okay. Many atheists claim that the only way they would ever believe in the existence of God would be if there were empirical or scientific evidence for it. And there are many Christians who claim that there is, in fact, such evidence. But should we really be saying this? For those new to the party, let me give an example of the kind of evidence I'm talking about.
Consider, first, evidence from the expansion of the universe. The standard Big Bang cosmogonic model implies that the universe is not infinite in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. Although advances in astrophysical cosmology have forced various revisions in the standard model, nothing has called into question its fundamental prediction of the finitude of the past and the beginning of the universe.
This is Christian philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig giving his opening statement in his debate against theoretical physicist Dr. Sean Carroll. Here he's talking about Big Bang cosmology and how the Big Bang shows that the universe has a beginning, unlike previous models which would have said otherwise.
Indeed, as James Sinclair has shown, the history of 20th century cosmogony has seen a parade of failed theories trying to avert the absolute beginning predicted by the standard model. Meanwhile, a series of remarkable singularity theorems has increasingly tightened the loop around empirically tenable cosmogonic models by showing that under more and more generalized conditions, a beginning is inevitable. In 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning.
The argument then goes that if the universe had a beginning, then that means something caused it, because anything that begins to exist has a cause. And if something caused the universe, one could extrapolate from there that this cause must be immaterial and timeless and spaceless and all sorts of other fun stuff. This is a brief description of what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Nowadays, it's basically the most popular argument among Christians. And here it is in syllogistic form from the same debate.
Consider first the Kalam cosmological argument. 1. If the universe began to exist, then there is a transcendent cause which brought the universe into existence. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, there is a transcendent cause which brought the universe into existence.
And here it is in Spanish. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Anyway, it's important to note that this is only one version of the Kalam, and there are other versions which don't make reference to science at all. And so the criticisms I make here won't apply to those other versions. However, it will apply to nearly any attempt to use science to prove God. Whether that be with Big Bang cosmology, fine-tuning, or DNA, or the complexity of the eyeball, take your pick. And I want to stress here that the particular scientific facts and details won't actually matter for our purposes, since I'm talking about the idea of using science to prove God in general. And I'm just using the Kalam and Big Bang cosmology because it happens to be a useful illustration. And this argument is insanely popular, so it only makes sense that I would talk about it. The strategy of using science to prove God has come to dominate the Christian intellectual space. But here's the problem. Even if arguments like the Kalam were 100% sound and valid, saying we have scientific evidence for God is either technically not true, or it's easily misunderstood in a way that opens you up to objections you otherwise shouldn't have to deal with. But if the Big Bang is a sound theory, which certainly seems to point to some kind of creator, then wouldn't that mean we have scientific evidence for God? Well, that depends on what you mean. Science by its very nature is only concerned with the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation, experimentation, and the testing of theories against the evidence obtained. But God is not physical or a part of the natural world. God is not a scientific hypothesis. Theism is not a cosmological model. So what then does that mean for an argument like the Kalam? At its core, it's a philosophical argument, and one version of this argument has its second premise supported by science. And serious defenders of the Kalam are careful to make this distinction.
This is not to make some sort of naive claim that contemporary cosmology proves the existence of God. There is no God of the gaps reasoning here. Rather, I'm saying that contemporary cosmology provides significant evidence in support of premises in philosophical arguments for conclusions having theological significance. For example, the key premise in the ancient Kalam cosmological argument that the universe began to exist is a religiously neutral statement which can be found in virtually any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics. It is obviously susceptible to scientific confirmation or disconfirmation on the basis of the evidence. So, to repeat, one is not employing the evidence of contemporary cosmology to prove the proposition that God exists, but to support theologically neutral premises in philosophical arguments for conclusions that have theistic significance.
So if by scientific evidence you mean we can make an inference which goes beyond the merely physical given the science, then you could in that sense say we have scientific evidence for God. I mean, assuming the Kalam otherwise works and it's sound and valid and all that. But if you're going by a more standard definition, which would preclude anything outside the physical and natural order, then it's technically not true to say we have scientific evidence for God. In fact, it couldn't be true in principle. But isn't all this just splitting hairs anyway? I mean, really, what's the difference? Why does it matter, and why should anyone care? The difference is that a clever atheist is gonna know that science in principle can't really prove that God exists, and it's gonna leave you open to objections you otherwise wouldn't have to deal with. Which brings us to the second prong of our dilemma. It's too easily misunderstood. Some of you may be familiar with the God of the gaps objection. It basically goes something like this. If someone doesn't know the natural explanation for something, then they might be tempted to think that God is the explanation. And so it's this fallacious inference. It's like, I don't know what caused X, therefore God done did it. Which is clearly not valid reasoning, right? And so the story goes, throughout history you had scientifically ignorant people and they'd say things like, hey, what caused that lightning over there? And someone would be like, I don't know, man, it's probably like this really jacked dude and he lives on a mountain and he has like these cool lightning powers, like he throws lightning bolts and stuff, and yeah, this dude is like absolutely shredded, like he must be on that protein or something, you know what I'm saying? But then as our scientific knowledge grew, we realized that we were wrong and stupid to think that gods caused such things. And so now we're at a point in time where we've basically learned our lesson, and so instead of saying that God caused anything, we just wait for science to have the answer. Of course, I'd argue that there are things that science in principle could never explain, and that could only be explained by a transcendent cause. I've talked about this at length elsewhere, so I'm not going to bore you here with that, but back to the God of the Gaps fallacy. One way to think about it is that when someone commits the God of the Gaps fallacy, it's like they're trying to do science, but just doing so poorly. Since they're trying to explain natural phenomena, they're just doing it the wrong way. And this is exactly what it sounds like to atheists when Christians claim there's scientific evidence for God. It's like they're trying to do science, but they're just doing science poorly. And depending on what is meant by scientific evidence, they just well may be. But the charge of committing the God of the Gaps fallacy only succeeds if the defender of the Kalam is flat out claiming the Big Bang just is scientific evidence for God, in the ordinary sense of the term. But serious defenders of the Kalam aren't doing science poorly. They're not trying to do science at all. It's a philosophical argument, and the way that many people like to support that second premise is by appealing to things we know from science. That's it. And while this version of the argument may be probabilistic and open to falsification because it relies on science, I don't see how it's relying on any gap in our scientific knowledge. And so, properly understood, I don't see how the Kalam is committing the God of the Gaps fallacy. But if you present the Kalam in a way that doesn't make that distinction clear between the philosophy and the science, or worse, if you just outright say that the Big Bang or DNA or the complexity of the eyeball just literally is scientific evidence for God, then you're going to have to deal with this objection that you otherwise shouldn't have to. And the only way out of it is by clarifying that it's not actually scientific evidence for God. But it gets worse than that, because even when you're careful to make that distinction, as Dr. Craig was, it falls on deaf ears. Which is why a large portion of Dr. Carroll's response in this debate could be boiled down to saying, "You're doing science wrong, science doesn't work like that, here, let me show you how to do it."
The real problem is that these are not the right vocabulary words to be using when we discuss fundamental physics and cosmology. This kind of Aristotelian analysis of causation was cutting-edge stuff 2,500 years ago. Today we know better. Our metaphysics must follow our physics. That's what the word metaphysics means. And modern physics, you open a quantum field theory textbook or a general relativity textbook, you will not find the words transcendent cause anywhere. What you should be doing is trying to build models, like I said. So the question is, are there realistic models of eternal cosmologies? Well, I spent half an hour on the internet. I was able to come up with about 17. Meanwhile, theism, I would argue, is not a serious cosmological model. That's because cosmology is a mature subject. We care about more things than just creating the universe. We care about specific details. At the cosmology conferences, we're discussing these questions that you see before you. I'm not going to list all of them, but a real cosmological model wants to predict what is the amount of density perturbation in the universe and so forth. Theism does not even try to do this because ultimately theism is not well defined. And that misses the point of my argument. I was not actually putting forward these as strong predictions of theism. I was making the point that there are no strong predictions of theism. It's not that there should be no evil in the world if God exists. It's that you can always wriggle out of the prediction that there should be no evil in the world if God exists. That's why it's not a good theory of the world generally. That's not why that is why it is not a good cosmological model particularly.
Except theism can't be a bad cosmological model because it's not trying to be a cosmological model in the first place. Because once again, the Big Bang is not scientific evidence for God, it's merely supporting a premise in a broader argument. You could say it's scientific evidence that the universe began to exist, sure, but it takes a further inference and argumentation to say that God is the cause of that beginning. What Dr. Carroll is doing here would be like if you wrote a book of poetry and I read it and I say, "Man, this is the worst novel I ever read. I can't even tell what the plot is or who the characters are. This isn't how you write a novel. Here, let me show you how to write a novel."
I hope that it's been obvious tonight that I am not offering God as a theory to compete with scientific theories about the universe. Rather, I am saying that those self-contained secular theories provide evidence for theologically neutral premises in philosophical arguments leading to a conclusion that has theistic significance. Premises like the universe began to exist, or the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or to chance. And if those premises are supported, then it follows deductively that there is a creator and designer of the universe. Dr. Carroll's complaints about theism not making predictions would be only important if I were offering some sort of theistic theory of the world, but I'm not doing so.
And so Dr. Carroll's objections, along with the God of the Gaps objection more broadly, is based on a misunderstanding. Though I find it difficult to blame the atheist for this, because really any attempt to use science to prove God really does sound like a God of the Gaps argument. I mean, put yourself in the atheist's shoes, and think about someone telling you how a peculiar phenomenon is actually explained by God. Doesn't it kind of sound like early people trying to explain lightning? And really, the only way to answer the God of the Gaps argument is by explaining that it's not actually meant to be scientific evidence in the first place. But if that's the only way out of it, then what was the point in presenting it as scientific evidence in the first place? Of course, Dr. Craig didn't do that, but many less serious defenders do. I think the best way to avoid the God of the Gaps objection altogether is by giving arguments that don't make any reference to science at all, like an argument which explains something that science in principle could never explain, even if we had discovered everything we possibly could via science, because the premises of the argument would remain true regardless of what the scientific facts turn out to be. Oh, but where are we gonna find an argument like that? Alright, so here's the bottom line. If you're convinced by the Kalam and similar arguments that use science, that's great. If that's where your passion lies as a Christian apologist and you really want to defend those arguments, awesome. But if you're going to do that, make sure to not present them as though they are direct scientific evidence for God. In fact, you should probably take it a step further, as William Lane Craig does, and explicitly deny such a claim. And even then, you should be prepared to answer the God of the Gaps objection and similar objections to the effect that you're doing science wrong. Okay.
And one reason for that is the way that modern intellectual life, like so much of modern life, has become fragmented, so that you have a kind of hyper-specialization where someone like Richard Dawkins, for example, who obviously knows a lot about biology and, is worth listening to when he talks about that. Even when one disagrees with him, he's going to say things that are interesting. But he doesn't, it's obvious he doesn't have any training in philosophy. But that doesn't prevent him from pontificating. And they also end up saying things that try to translate the issue they're addressing into something they know about. Mm-hmm. So, like, if you read Lawrence Krauss on theism, on the question of whether God exists, he tries to basically translate it into, or transform it into, a problem of physics, which it's not. It's a problem that is, the arguments for God's existence are really, the great arguments historically, the most important ones, are grounded in claims that go deeper than physics.